Sociology. Welcome to this discussion on race and ethnicity. So sociologists break race and ethnicity into two different concepts for discussion, but sociologists generally regard both as social constructs. So when we look at the difference between race and ethnicity, we think of ethnicity as cultural characteristics, such as the type of clothing people wear, food that they eat, their religion, their sense of cultural heritage. And we think of race as physiological characteristics, such as texture of hair, average height of the group of people, the shape of nose, lips, ears, skin color. These are all identified as race. They're racial characteristics. Now, the reality of this is that the classification of a racial group changes over time. Names change, and the lines between race and ethnicity are blurry. There are about 7.2 billion people in the world, and many share skin texture, color, but would be of different cultural backgrounds. So when we look at races, there's really no such thing as pure races. Nowadays, we have the advantage of DNA testing. You can get a DNA test, and it will show you the percentage of race within your blood. So the idea of a fixed number of races is also arbitrary. Many scientists can't agree on how many races there are. And the idea that race is fixed by biology. You can think of race depending more on the society in which we live. I oftentimes ask my students who identify as white with a show of hands, and I ask those students if they can prove Anglo ancestry or English background, and usually only a few can. And according to certain US Census data, 1900s to 1920s, only individuals who were British were considered white. So if you came from Poland, you definitely wouldn't be considered white. If you were German ancestry, so the term white was less referencing skin color as it was specifically discussing white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, English ancestry, Protestant religion. So the lines between ethnicity and race are oftentimes blurred. So what does it mean to be a racial minority or an ethnic minority? So a minority group speaks to people who are treated unequally by a dominant group. This could be an example. The Irish were mistreated by the British when they came in because of the Irish potato famine. The potato famine in Ireland led many Irish immigrants into New York City, and there was tension, and ethnic conflict and tension, specifically over factory jobs. So the dominant group would be the group with greater power, privilege, and property. Minority groups are not necessarily small in number. If we look at an example of South African apartheid, the Dutch and those of Dutch ancestry, Afrikaners in South Africa constituted only 10% of the population. So 90% were native to South Africa, but Afrikaners spoke Dutch. And if you didn't speak Dutch, you didn't get into school. And if you didn't get to school, then you didn't graduate, you didn't get a diploma and go to university. And so all social institutions in South Africa that spoke Dutch. So it was really Nelson Mandela who was the first native South African really after imprisonment to advance politically. So the characteristics of a minority group. This is membership is an ascribed status. Physical or cultural traits are held in low esteem by dominant group. They oftentimes force marriage within the own group. It was actually illegal in the United States for whites and blacks to marry through Jim Crow segregation, but these laws remained on the books. So it was, interracial marriage was illegal in South Carolina up until 1996. These laws remained on the books. Now that's pretty significant. I graduated from high school in 1995, and this seems to me as just the blink of an eye. 25 years, 26 years has passed very quickly, as well as society. But the sense of group solidarity within an ethnic or racial minority group can be pretty significant. However, if an individual does not live among their ethnic and minority group, then they can feel separated. So when we look at the difference between discrimination and prejudice, we think of discrimination as an action and prejudice as an attitude. So discrimination is an action, prejudice the attitude. And sociologists, many theorize that racist attitudes are learned from association. Kathleen Blee was a sociologist who investigated and studied women who joined the Klan and other hate groups. And she found that many of these women were not racist before the membership of this group. So they developed these racist attitudes and ideals simply from relationships. Hartley suggested that people become racist because of ignorance. The idea here was he did a research study where he asked if people did not like Perennians and Danarians. And these were fictitious groups that he made up. And people who were more likely to say they did not like these groups were also likely to be racist. And the idea here is that we don't like things that we don't know. Sociologists have also asked the question about whether we can discriminate and not be prejudiced. So the idea of discrimination is, let's say you have individual discrimination where you choose to not do something. The idea of discrimination, so let me clarify. Robert Merton is a sociologist who said that we can be prejudiced and not discriminate. If you own a business and you're sure to pay all employees fairly, promote them fairly, but if you have negative ideas about your workforce, you have not discriminated, but you have been prejudiced. Robert Merton, however, also said it is possible to not be prejudiced and discriminate. So for instance, if you're not prejudiced, let's say you work for a bank and the bank has systemic racism built into its loan and lending practices. So if there's certain laws that favor some groups, and if you are working for the bank and you are unknowingly carrying out systemic racism, Merton said it is possible that you're not prejudiced, you don't have those ideas, but you can play a part in the system. And that is really kind of the idea behind systemic racism. There's a lot of that in our discussions today, especially in a political cycle in an election year. But when you examine individual versus institutional discrimination, individual discrimination is the negative treatment of one person by another. This would obviously involve using the N-word to African Americans, using racial or ethnic slurs. But institutional discrimination can be more subtle. It's woven into societal institutions. So for instance, if you compare the applicants for home loans who are accepted as opposed to those who are denied, even when income is above the median income. So when someone has more income coming in above the average, you could say that African Americans and Latinos are denied at a higher rate than Caucasians. Even when these are subprime loans, applicants who have 100 to 120% of the median income. So when you look at the course or the state of systemic racism, it's important to take a look at policy, to take a look at what policy is being passed to regulate the lending agency. That law enforcement is a really hot topic right now, and the idea as to whether or not laws and even practices of how we pull people over, are these influenced by implicit bias, implicit racism, which would be kind of this, a law enforcement officer may say, well, I had a hunch, or it just didn't feel right. Sometimes these sociologists would say are influenced by implicit bias. We have these biases that are almost subconscious. Some psychological theories of prejudice basically say that we take frustrations out. When a dominant group is getting frustrated, we are unable to strike out at the real source of their frustration. We look for someone to blame. So if the economy tanks, then a minority group may be blamed. Other ideas that come from a psychological perspective, Theodore Adorno argued that ethnocentrism, anti-Semitism, and support for an authoritarian leaders are oftentimes criteria connected with an authoritarian personality. But sociologists would differ. Some sociologists would say that prejudice can bring people together, but can create negative stereotypes, which is the dysfunction. In terms of the conflict theory, prejudice is seen as beneficial only to the dominant group and keeps the minority group suppressed, and even creates a split labor force, whereas you're sending the dominant race to white-collar jobs and the oppressed class to the service sector and to blue-collar work. Now, according to the symbolic interactionist perspective, labels are created, and this leads to selective perception. So if you have the idea that someone from a minority group is a certain way, you simply scan the news media or Twitter and you find an individual who fits that bill, and you see, okay, you see what I told you, folks from this group are always like this. Now, I just challenge students to be aware of the labels that we have in our minds, avoid statements such as those people, because those overgeneralizations oftentimes lead to labeling. And in terms of thinking from a conflict perspective, I think if there is systemic oppression and systemic racism, then policymakers should be challenged to examine policy and to make sure that a policy is not unfairly targeting a specific group, whether that's law enforcement, whether that is mortgage loans, whether that is lending, whether that's education. All of these things need to be considered. Now, in terms of global patterns of intergroup relations, Genocide. Genocide is the intentional killing of a people group. Now, this was the Holocaust. This does not have to be along racial lines. It could be along ethnic lines. The idea of ethnic cleansing was used in Bosnia, in Serbia, Montenegro, where there was a three-way civil war between Orthodox and between Muslims, and it was very violent, very brutal. So three different religions clashed, and the idea was that each of them thought that they were the true, right, the true national, true Bosnians. If a group of people cannot be completely eradicated, then population transfer takes place. So if you look at the intergroup relationships between Americans and Native Americans, Native Indians, Native Americans were put on the Trail of Tears and were forced evacuations and sent to reservations. And after that, then we saw a sort of forced assimilation where they were sent to boarding schools and forbidden speaking their native language. And the Native American languages are almost all completely gone. When you look in terms of the internal colonialism, this would be given menial jobs to minority groups, so they're used in low-income, low-wage jobs. Segregation would be below internal colonialism. Segregation then is what we saw in the Jim Crow South, where states under the auspices of separate but equal were allowed to segregate, and laws were then put into place called Jim Crow laws. Every state was allowed to segregate, so as long as they were providing separate but equal services, and separate was not equal, and separate water fountains, separate sitting on the back of the bus, being forced to sit up and evacuate your seat, separate movie theaters or separate sections within movie theaters. Now, assimilation, if it is permissive, then this gives the minority group the right to assimilate to the dominant culture. But forced assimilation is, as I've previously mentioned, it's telling Native Americans that they can't speak their native language. It's sending them to boarding schools, wearing ties, etc. Multiculturalism is where all societies, all cultures are allowed and celebrated within a culture. So with assimilation, the dominant group absorbs the minority groups. So for instance, American Czechoslovakians that may take a Western name, having something of an Anglo appearance, join the melting pot. However, some ethnicities aren't allowed into the melting pot and don't want to lose their own unique cultural identity. So other white Europeans were seen as inferior from WASPs. The nation's founders included only those from England. Now, Latinos are the largest racial ethnic minority group in the U.S., totaling over 42 million. The country of origin is significant. People from Colombia would not see themselves as identifying with individuals from Cuba or folks from Mexico. And the U.S. is the largest Spanish-speaking nation in the world, and that we have the largest collection of Spanish-speaking individuals. They're underrepresented in politics. Compared with whites, Asian Americans, Latinos have less income, higher unemployment, and poverty. The majority of Spanish-speaking people and people of Hispanic backgrounds are from California, Texas, and Florida. These are also big electoral swing states. African Americans, after slavery was abolished, the southern states passed Jim Crow segregation, as I mentioned. The 1964 Civil Rights Act eliminated discrimination based on race. You had the Watts riots in 1965, and another critical juncture was 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Then you have the second Civil Rights Act was passed, but it wasn't until the early 70s and mid 70s here in the South where we start to see forced desegregation of schools. And in the past 40 years, 45 years, we see remarkable gains made in politics, education, and jobs in African Americans. Half of all African American families make more than $35,000 a year, but $35,000 a year is well beyond or below your middle class income. So what we're seeing is that income of African Americans is increasing, but we do see deficits of wealth, because wealth is accumulated with every generation, because you have white families leaving their wealth at their death, and it's staying in their families, it's staying within racial lines. So if you want to describe it this way, white-owned properties are passed down to their white descendants. White wealth, white stock, white investments are passed down, usually across racial lines. Intermarriage, or marriage between races, as a way of distributing wealth. And so we are seeing higher rates of interracial marriage. And I guess in time we will see if this will be enough to start seeing wealth accumulate or increase in the African American community. In terms of Asian Americans have been referred to as the model minority because their nuclear family is strong. They have met their own history of discrimination, such as Japanese internment camps during World War II. There was Chinese railroad workers in the 1900s and 1920s were targeted at many different points. But we see success in family life and educational achievement and assimilation into culture. Perhaps one big difference between the Asian Americans that have immigrated and other minority groups is that Asian Americans have had a history of self-determination. And what that means is you have folks immigrating here from Asian countries, just like you see people immigrating here from European countries, wanting to find work, to find a better life. Whereas with African Americans, the slave trade brought them here against their will. If you take a look at this, self-determination, meaning a people group making really important decisions for themselves, immigrating here willingly, as opposed to by forced, as opposed to population transfer. I think that has a lot of import into the discussion. When we look at Native Americans, this group of folks is oftentimes referred to as the invisible minority. We see a lack of self-determination. So, for instance, for years I would talk about the name of the football team, right? The Washington Redskins. This year it was taken down. They have been renamed the Washington football team until they find a different permanent name. But the term redskin was the meaning. It was a term that Caucasians had about Native Americans. And so, what kind of, how would you like people to refer to you? What if someone else gave you a name and they called you the name? It wasn't a name your parents called you. It wasn't a name you referred to yourself. And this idea of self-determination, what does the group like to be referred to as? And if a people group don't have those, don't have a say in what how they were referred to, then it is it lowers self-determination. Something else that has complicated matters is that Native Americans are not one group. There are many groups. There's diversity of tribes. There are diversity of languages, diversity of religious practices, and so on. If you go to reservations, then no two reservations would look alike in their native dialect, native cultural identity. However, one thing that we are seeing is very high alcohol rates, alcohol use and abuse rates. Suicide is the highest among these minority groups. 42% live in inadequate housing on reservations. Many are moving into cities where they are disconnected from their ethnic identity. If you look at education completed, less than high school, only 11% of whites have less than high school education. However, 39.8% of Latinos have less than a high school education, so 40%. If you look at African Americans, it drops to 20%. Asian Americans drops to 14.4%, and Native Americans 23%. When you start moving up to high school graduates, you see 30% of Caucasians have a high school education. 28% of Caucasians have some college, 29%. And of all doctorates awarded, say 78% of all doctorates, whether it's a PhD or an EDD, almost 80% are awarded to Caucasians. And if you look at Latinos, only 4.7%. And if you look at the other groups of people, 7.8% of doctorates are awarded to African Americans, 8% to Asian Americans, and 5.7% to Native Americans. So higher education and academia. And the people who get doctorates are the people who go on and teach at universities and run colleges and departments and corporations. We are still in the midst of immigration debate. Waves of immigrants came to the U.S. in the 1800s and early 1900s. Today, more immigrants live in the United States than any other time in country's history. In California, racial ethnic minorities have become the majority. And there is a concern, though, that too many immigrants will change the character of the United States or will change the landscape of voting in the Electoral College. So it's an estimate by 2025, just a few years away, that the United States will be 59.3% white, and by 2050, the United States will be 50% white, with 30% being Latino, 12.2% being African American, 6% being Asian, 0.8% Native American, and the portion of people claiming membership in two groups is climbing as well. That's the end of the discussion. I look forward to hear what you have to say about these issues in a discussion board. All right, take care.